All right, so welcome back to Lunchtime BABLing. Man, we have a lot to talk about. I think we have enough to talk about that I've asked Jeffrey to come help me out and keep me sane on this crazy journey because man, what a crazy couple of weeks it's been, right? I mean, you've been keeping tabs on it. So let me first introduce Jeffrey. Jeffrey's our chief operating officer here at BABL, and he's currently on the front lines of taking inbound inquiries into uh, what regulations do people need to care about, and how can we help companies navigate this crazy landscape. But between the EU AI Act passing and the executive order, I guess it's been a month back now, and then all of the activities that NIST has been doing, so much is going on. So what have you seen? I'm curious to hear. Well, you can tell us about yourself, but after that, I want to hear what are you seeing on the ground in terms of the change in interest?
Um, yeah, there's a lot in that. It's definitely been a crazy year, I would say, and I think 2024 is just going to get, the floodgates just going to continue to open up in terms of AI regulation and the impacts that they have. Um, but yeah, just all the random states in the U.S. pushing new initiatives, all of these governor executive orders and the executive order from the president in the U.S. All these joint global initiatives going on, and then but the big one, of course, is the EU AI Act. And I mean, in terms of pain points for customers, it's without question the EU AI Act. Um, that is the latest thing that people are jumping on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's because it's really the first kind of besides New York City, which I mean we've talked a lot about all the work we're doing there, but besides that, this is really some of the first hard law that companies are going to have to do something about this.
Yeah, and it's definitely exciting, and I think it's important. It's important to protect people. Babbel's got all of these, this mission to prioritize human flourishing in an age of AI. So, I think regulations like this one, and this is a good one, kind of protect people while at the same time, allowing for a free market and innovation within the technology.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So so it hasn't passed um, per se. It's just simply there's an agreement now, and I think um, I, I mean let me start by saying a little bit about what I think is interesting about this agreement. So there's a lot of things. So the trilogue process, which is totally confusing to us Americans listening to it, but different European bodies, including the European Parliament and European Commission, they have to agree on the various versions of the act that they worked on. Um, and one version, which was the parliamentary version, had this thing called fundamental rights impact assessments, which I was very excited about. And it seems like that's stuck. So one of the few things that have come out of the press release from the final agreement saying we're done, it's a go, is that this fundamental rights impact assessment is still in there, and I think that's exciting.
Yeah, let's dive into that because, you know, I think your average listener is likely not going to know what that is, um, or at least maybe the nuances of it. The what separates that from other type of an impact assessment. I could be wrong, but I'm wondering if you could like kind of let us know on a high level what is a fundamental rights impact assessment and why is it important, especially as it relates to this regulation.
Yeah. So I think at, at a basic level, it is akin to and not very different from a human rights impact assessment. So fundamental rights are, I mean, human rights are fundamental rights, and I think the basic idea is that companies, and I'll specify a little bit more what I mean in a second. Companies have to now think about the ways in which their algorithmic systems impact fundamental rights that people have. And, because it's the European Union, they're focused on European rights, the rights that have been enshrined in European law. And so if you're going to have algorithmic system, and this is specific for high risk systems, so that there's a risk rating, and so not all algorithmic systems need to go through these. They have different obligations, but high risk systems, the deployer of those systems. So this is critical, and this is what I think it's important to note, is that a lot of the obligations of the EU AI Act are for developers. Things about testing their system, ongoing monitoring, having the right kind of governance, risk, kind of ordinary, I wouldn't call them ordinary, but risk assessments and risk management system, quality management system, and technical documentation. So there's a ton there, and that's part of what is, scaring potential clients here, is that there are a lot of obligations. Most of those are for deployers, for developers, but deployers are the ones who procure these systems. So it could be a bank, it could be a hospital, it could be a university. They've simply decided they're going to use a system that somebody else developed, but it's going to be in a high risk area. So that might be like hiring or something. They want to use it for hiring.
Yeah, I was gonna say, for context, what are some examples of high risk? Just your average listener coming in and watching this video or this podcast, what type of algorithm would raise a red flag, and I gotta consider this.
Well, if you're using it, there's a specific list for the EU, and so the best thing to do is Google that list. But it includes things like employment decisions. So if I'm going to use an algorithm to make employment decisions, if I'm going to use it in an educational context, especially to make kind of consequential decisions, and that medical context, sort of surveillance context. But the way to think about it is this algorithm making consequential decisions for people, or at least going to have a significant impact on decisions that get made about people that could affect their lives? That's sort of like, if I'm thinking first principles, how I would think about it. But it includes things like hiring and education and medicine. And so anybody who procures that, because a lot of organizations are going to use the AI, they're not going to necessarily develop it. Now they have this obligation to conduct a fundamental rights impact assessment. And the thing that's interesting about that is that that's not a standard thing that people do and that people are used to doing. Because what you really have to do is look at the system and say, how are we using it? So if we're thinking about the obligations under what does that impact assessment actually mean, you have to identify stakeholders. You have to, it's in the law, you actually need to engage those stakeholders too. And not just internal stakeholders like in your company. Let's say I'm a hospital and I'm using an algorithm that's high risk. I actually have to reach out and talk to stakeholders that are external. And that might be actual people. It could be advocacy groups. I have to document that. I have to identify what are the risks to their fundamental rights that this tool could pose. And so that's a very different mindset than the typical enterprise risk management process that some of these organizations would be used to. It really has a much more outward focus, and it takes a lot more nuance to think about it.
Yeah, so I'm curious the benefit, both to people and the companies using and producing these algorithms. What's the benefit of using this type of impact assessment versus a way they've been thinking about these risks previously?
Okay, good question. First, the benefit is that it's going to be required, and so you could get in trouble if you don't. So that's like the kind of the dumbest version of it. It's a compliance risk if you don't. I think maybe more importantly is that there's a significant benefit to the people that are interacting with that algorithm, because it's been a big ethos in BABL. I mean, we're very mission driven. What we're trying to do, the whole enterprise of what we're trying to do, is to mitigate risk to humans and to make sure that humans are prioritized. And the most vulnerable are always the ones with the least amount of power. And those are the people who are not in the company. Those are the people that are external, that this is getting used against them, or, somehow to influence their lives. And so for us, this is a really big win. Us meaning BABL, and for our mission, this is a really big win. It's forcing those companies to think about. So it's better for those people externally. Internally to the company, I think besides just mitigating compliance risks, like you got to do it, I think there's a real opportunity for gaining trust by doing this right. Not just doing it like a tick box exercise and just say we did it, but actually really doing it, because you want to demonstrate that you care about the people that interact with these systems, that you care about your employees. There's you want employees to feel good about interacting with that tool. You want employees to trust that tool. And so there's a lot of work that should go into thinking about how do we make this use of the tool trustworthy. Now, given that they're deployers and they're not the ones that developed it, the way they do that is to say, how do we use this tool in a way that minimizes risks to fundamental rights? The tool has been developed, and there's transparency requirements in the law that the developers have to give information about how the tool actually works to the deployers. But it's up to the deployers to make sure that they're using it in a way that is trustworthy and not going to infringe on fundamental rights. And that's a big gain, because I've said this before, if you think about the world, the future, where AI is making decisions every second about your life, and it's all over the place. Think about smart cities, think about automating every sort of bureaucracy. The companies that are going to win are the ones who are going to build trust, because in a world where it's all algorithm, the algorithm that I trust and the brand and institution that I trust is the one I'm going to get. And this is the first part of that. Do you care about fundamental rights? And so it's part of a bigger story.
Yeah, and I think it also echoes, the awareness that people are starting to have towards the risk that AI can pose. Early on, there might have been some naive, naive use of AI tools, but especially in the last year, I could say just in my personal life, people had never even talked about AI in their lives before are now very aware of it. And it's in the space of everyone. And along with that is also just the risk of AI. So if you can, build trust to your consumers that your algorithms are, hold a certain level of integrity, that's a massive competitive advantage. One question I have is, so you mentioned this is good for BABL. This is good in general. This is good for the mission and all of that. Can someone, whether it be a vendor or a deployer, can people do these on their own? And even if they can do them on their own, should they? Or should they go to someone, like BABL, and if not BABL, anyone else, and what the importance is of, say, and having an objective third party come in and do this for you?
Yeah, so I think that they should get external help. I mean, I'm biased obviously because we own a company that does this, and not only does, part of my excitement is that fundamental rights impact assessments is literally the methodology that we spent the past 5 years developing and perfecting. Is getting smart people in the room, digging around systems, really identifying stakeholders. Where can this algorithm follow? That's what we've been doing for the past 5 years. So the alignment is striking. And I'm not saying that people should get help just because that would be great for our company, which I think that is also a good reason. I think it is useful to get an external perspective. And ideally to get somebody who's done this before. Because if you take the average sort of enterprise risk management person, or somebody who does compliance in an organization, the mindset is different. The skill sets are different. It's not to say that they can't do it. And I think, we have training courses really geared towards how do you take somebody from a particular discipline who has related skills and get them to be able to do this. But I think there is an art to it. And there are a lot of places where risk, and risk in particular of fundamental rights, can hide. Both in the technical aspects, like you have to understand the algorithms as well, but the socio-technical, where the algorithms interface with people, and that's something that is difficult to do. Now, could you cobble together something and that looks okay enough? Yeah, I think that that's a possibility. But if you're the kind of company that wants to go kind of above and beyond in terms of demonstrating trust and actually really assuring that they are complying with the law, getting people who've done this before successfully is, I think, important.
I would echo that. Now, I'd follow up as well, and just, you know, we're constantly learning new ways that algorithms can cause harm and be biased. You know, and having experts that look at algorithms all the time in various contexts, I think that's important to kind of have somebody new and fresh come in and poke around and try and challenge in a way that, you know, your team likely hasn't thought of before. Um, you know, you can unintentionally just have groupthink in any type of organization, right? So just having a critical, objective person come in and poke around, I feel like is just, that's added bonus, right? It's added value.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But I think, we give a lot of this stuff away for free. So if I were a company, so I mean, it's worth it just explaining how this works. Let me go very quickly through this. And I think I've talked about this before in Lunchtime BABLing, but now it's a brand new context and brand new motivation for thinking about this. I've talked about it before, and it's validating that now all of a sudden we have obligations. We meaning deployers of high-risk AI systems are going to have obligations to actually do this, and that's exciting. But the basic idea is you got to get you got to figure out where the high-risk systems are that you have. That's a whole nother thing with inventories and sort of risk identification and categorizing that needs to happen, right? So let's assume that has.
And it can be a lot. Like, I think the average, I saw some metric recently. It said like the average company has something like 83 different tools that they're
Yeah,
using
oh,
now.
exactly. I mean, I think it's easy to hide for these systems to hide. But the key is look for places where is consequential impact or consequential decisions getting made, and look at the AI that is maybe supporting that. That's a good sort of cheat sheet for finding those things. But once you've identified it, you basically say, okay, I have a high risk system now. How do you start the process? So if you haven't hired anybody, you can't hire BABL, you can't get any external counsel or anything like that. You literally just need to assemble a cross-functional team and say, okay, we need to get into a room. And the process is fairly straightforward. The execution is difficult, but conceptually the process is very straightforward. You have to figure out who your stakeholders are. So stakeholder mapping is very key. This is going to sound familiar to anybody doing these sorts of assessments in other fields as well. You got to really figure out those stakeholders, who's interacting with the system. You have to really delineate what we mean by the system. So I have a high risk, let's say it's a hiring tool or something that's used to monitor or to figure out what kind of insurance premium somebody should have. Like, you just take that system and you figure out, okay, what are all the relevant features of that system? What kind of model is it? Who's interacting with it? How much understanding does the person who's using it have? How is it governed? All of that. We have a name for it. It's called the CETA framework, but it really is just dig around until you fully understand the system. Identify the stakeholders. Identify the sort of rights or interests that those stakeholders have relative to, well, you can just look at the European Union's fundamental rights. There's a list of them, right? What are the ways this tool could impact some of those? So things like in educational context, people have right to an education. They have right to, access to jobs. There's a lot of things on that list where you could very easily start to recognize that, oh, this system really directly impacts that. Then you need to start, and then there's more layers. So be aware of the fact that you'll have to add to that list as you go through this process. You won't get them all in the first run. So keep that list open. Then you need to start looking at all of those features of the system which you have just dug around and identified, and say, what features of the system highly impact those rights, either in terms of infringing upon them potentially, or maybe in some cases they might be really good, like it's allowing people to find jobs easier and that kind of thing. So keeping the positive in that list as well, and start really digging into that in an interdisciplinary way. And so what likely will happen is at the end of that first meeting, you would have had a nice list of, here are all the interests or of fundamental rights we think we're worried about. Here's a bunch of features of our system. And when I say features, it could be like, how much training does this person have, or who's monitoring what, or the amount of bias. You'll have that list too. And then you're going to have a list of questions that you just don't know, because there's only so many people in the room. You need to go find out answers to those questions, come back 2 weeks later after you've got the answers to those questions. And then what you're digging around is to figure out, did we get that right? Did we find more things? Once you've really identified and honed in on the sources of that risk to fundamental rights, then you ask yourself, what are the controls we can put in place to mitigate those? And then you need to start applying those controls. Now, there are specific requirements that you have to actually reach out to stakeholders. So if you are doing this with a mind of, I need to comply with the EU AI Act when it passes and when it comes into effect, then you need to start documenting the fact that you've reached out and talked to other people. You just got to write it down. Same thing with this. You'd have to write these minutes down for the meeting and produce a document. That's the step. Get those mitigation measures in place, and then ask yourself, how am I going to check to see whether those mitigation measures are actually working? You start thinking about metrics. You start thinking about monitoring the tool, oversight. Now, once you go through that process, if you do that correctly and you do that right, you would have already filled in a pretty big swath of a lot of the other things that the EU AI Act requires. But that's basically the cheat sheet. That was probably more than what people were asked for. But if I were to just say, if you're starting from scratch, what would you do? Like literally just go through those steps. And you're going to find that probably there will be a lot of spaces where we're going to be wondering, how could I get help? And that's probably where you would say, we need to go ask somebody, either technical stuff or legal stuff, or just general risk management. But that's a good start. And I think companies that do that we've talked to, we've seen they are much more aware of what their risk profile is. They know much more how they need to proceed.
I just gotta say, I always appreciate how you break down complex things and make it very understandable.
Oh,
Just a good reminder of that.
Well, I've been a professor for 11 years now, so it forces me to do it.
Yep. Yeah, so that actually is a good segue into one of the questions I had. So I think that usually when people think about AI, they think about these big companies, right? The ones that are in the news all the time, the ones deploying all these big names, ChatGPT, and Google's got its tools, and IBM Watson, whatever. But especially in the last year with all of this AI buzz, there's kind of been a surge in the startup world. Innovation is just kind of going crazy right now when it comes to AI. And I'm curious, your thoughts on the impact that not just the EU AI Act, but maybe since we're talking about this fundamental rights impact assessment, how that requirement would impact, say, a startup as it's developing AI for the first time, or even as companies, if it's not a startup, maybe it's a company that isn't using its technology, isn't their primary product, but they're looking, how can we implement AI into what we do today, right? I'm curious your thoughts on how this would impact the development.
Yeah, there's no way around the fact that this is going to have an impact. Like I think the criticisms that companies have been leveling against the EU AI Act are legitimate. That this is not an easy lift. There are a huge number of requirements. And so if you're a startup or, I mean, they're carving out exceptions for small businesses and things like this. I don't think it will be so straightforward that everybody has to comply with all of this all at once. And so I think that remains to be seen. I'll say that first. But there's no way around the fact that, like, as if you want to be a successful AI business, or you want to be a business that utilizes AI in a lot of their processes, including especially critical ones that are critical and high risk under the EUA Act, I think you are going to have to spend money to be compliant with this. Now, that being said, I think the argument from the European side and the policymakers and the civil society and some businesses is that this Europe wants to be innovative in a particular way that is robust in the long term. So responsible innovation. And I think they think, and you know a lot about ESG stuff. There's similar arguments made on the ESG side, is that it's better to be resilient now to the changes that are going to happen in the future. And resiliency in the case of AI means that you want to build these things with as little technical and, more importantly, ethical debt as possible. And so you don't build it fast and just wait until it breaks something. You build it in a responsible way, knowing that in the long term, your employees are going to be happier because they're working for a company that cares. Your clients are going to be happier because they are getting a product that is not going to damage their reputation or risk them. And they can deploy AI that is trusted. Because one of the things that I think we've seen a ton of hype about AI recently. We have not seen a massive amount of actual deployments. You know, if you take large language models, it's working its way into products that already exist. There are some new products out there that are being successful, yes. However, the sweeping changes of everybody's got LLMs integrated very nicely into the system. You know, we know from talking to these companies that's not happened yet. Why hasn't that happened? Because they don't know if they can trust it. They don't know what's happening to their data. They don't know if it's going to be wrong, or if it's going to be you sort of use inflammatory language or just say bad things. And so there's uncertainty there. And I think the price you pay in the beginning for being careful and responsible, the idea is it's going to pay off in the end because you win that trust race, because it is going to be a race. Who trusts these systems more? And there needs to be thoughtful, you need to be thoughtful about how you build up a body of evidence that you are a trustworthy company, and this system should be trusted and you can deploy it without fear of problems happening. And so I think it's going to be a cost. There's no doubt about it. They're absolutely right about that. However, there are benefits at the other end. I absolutely guarantee that. However, the balance of that is what's in question. And I think one of the problems that BABL is trying to solve is that we care very deeply about that implementation of responsible AI and the verification of that through audit. But what we also care about is it needs to be cost effective. It needs to be efficient. It needs to be trustworthy and transparent. And there needs to be companies like us trying to solve that problem so that other companies can succeed at doing what they're trying to do, solve their problems. And that's a tricky thing. And that's why we've moved slow. That's why we've been very careful and, done research alongside trying to develop actual products, is because we know that balance is going to be critically important for like the future of this entire industry. So we'll see. It remains to be seen.
Yeah, no, that's a lot of good points. Yeah, you don't want to be too much of a hindrance to innovation, especially, the resources, that idea of, the starting a company with a laptop in your garage type thing. If there's these massive barriers of entry just to get to regulatory compliance, that could be, you know, that could really harm innovation and opportunities for the entrepreneurs, right?
Yeah, you want to have carve outs for research and development and open source, some open source systems, because we want to move ahead. We want our society to move ahead. It just we don't. We also want to slow it down in some respects because we know the risks are increasing. And I'm not talking about killer robots, although that will eventually be a worry. It's more just the everyday risks that people who interact with these systems are feeling now.
Yeah, but I mean, and on that point too, I mean, the headlines are always going to be the general purpose Terminator, end of the world type stuff, but underneath that is real harm happening to average people all the time, and sometimes it's you don't know until you start looking under the hood, right? Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious if you have any like first steps for someone, whether they're looking at the EU AI Act, whether they're just looking at um, doing a fundamental rights impact assessment. Like, what's some low hanging fruit? What are some first steps to consider? Um, what's a good nudge someone should take to go forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the best answer is going to have to be broken down by the size and the type of the company. So, like if you're so for enterprise companies or large organizations that are very heavily reliant on AI, the getting an inventory is really one of the first things. Like you have to have visibility into where AI lives in your organization. And this has been a problem. A lot of organizations we've talked to have started that process, and some are further along than others. But those who have not have got to do that now. The very first thing you do after listening to this is go figure out, do you have an inventory? And if not, start it. Because uh, risk, if you have a sort of centralized risk management function, they need to know where the AI is because that's part of the risk profile now. So that's number one. So for big organizations, get that. Uh, for all organizations of all size, including enterprise size, but SMEs, you need to start thinking about assigning some functions and some responsibility for this task. So, I've talked about this in my courses. All of all of governance. I mean, all of anything. But when we're talking about risk management and governance, it all boils down to people, the things that they do, and the tools they use to do it. Right? That's true of everything, but it's important to focus. I'm going to highlight it here because if you don't have any of that happening for this risk management, then you are literally doing nothing. So the easiest one to do is to have a person or people. And so figure out who is it in your organization that is responsible for just looking into this stuff. How are we going to comply with the EUA Act? Is it the compliance officer? Is it the general counsel? Is it you have a risk management function or internal audit? Maybe you want to do that. It depends on your organization, but get somebody who's going to be responsible and start driving this forward. That's kind of like step number 2 after the inventories. Probably step number 3 is to get that person or people who are in charge of this to start thinking about what are the overall principles. Now, that's a bit of a fluffy thing that I think a lot of businesses would be like, why are we thinking about that? But it's important to know what you're maximizing for. Like, what do you stand for? Because most organizations have corporate values, and there'll be principles that kind of flow from those values. And you think of principles as like uh, sort of high level words almost, like things like fairness and transparency and stuff like that. But below those are then the commitments that you have to further those principles. And that's where you need to get to very quickly. Like, I know I care about non-discrimination, let's say, or I care about being transparent, or I care about improving the lives of my customers. But what commitments does that do you have relative to your use of algorithmic systems to make sure those principles are furthered. And so that's the step you need to get to, is like figure out what your principles are first. What do you really care about as a company? What are you prioritizing? And then the next step underneath that is, what are the commitments we have? And that's where you're starting to talk about policies and procedures. So that's the next layer. And then I'm going to say the next thing, and I'll stop there. I won't go too deep. After you have that, some idea of like, well, we have commitments. We want to make sure we don't want to discriminate against people. And when we're hiring them, we want to make sure we have a diverse workforce and all that stuff. Our commitment is to be fair when we make hiring decisions, let's say. That might be one principle that's relative to the AI that you're using. And so we want to ensure, I'm speaking as a company now, we want to ensure that the tools that we use don't have inherent bias in them that could lead to discriminatory hiring decisions, right? So that's your commitment. And then you need to start building the policies and procedures that are going to enforce that commitment. So if I were worried about complying with the EU AI Act, what I would literally do is start thinking about, what does my risk management system look like relative to those systems? What are the policies and procedures I need to do? How am I going to measure and monitor that? Like, how am I going to make sure that the risk is being identified and being mitigated? And I would wrap that in something called a quality management system. Now, why am I using those words? Because that's the words that the EU Act uses. And so literally just starting documents that have those words in them is a good first step. That if someone were to ask, like, what are you doing about the EU Act? Well, I've at least started this document. I have somebody who's responsible for it. We have principles, we have commitments, and we are working on setting up a quality management system, a risk management system, ongoing monitoring and technical documentation that is going to further those commitments that we have and make sure that we are being compliant with the EU AI Act. So that's what I would do. It sounds like a lot, but it's actually a very linear process that in the end of a very long week, you could actually have some demonstrably, evidence that you are actually doing something about it.
Very well said. I feel like it was a good bow on the conversation too.
All right. I say we, the thing I should say, I have on camera, is if you like this, if you like this content, and you want to hear more of this, or you have ideas for things you'd like us to talk about or issues you want to cover, please let us know in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you can. That helps us out to spread the word. And we'll see you later on another episode of Lunchtime BABLing.
Thank you.